welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley and today I'm going to be giving you short book recommendations for the best thriller and horror books under 300 pages. I love a good short horror or thriller book. Anything under 300 pages really, it can be any genre. I just love small books. I love the way they feel in my hands while I'm reading them. I love being able to read them all in one sitting. I love when an author can tell a story in a really concise way that really packs a punch. So today I just wanted to share with you some of my favorite books that I have read in the thriller and horror genres that are under 300 pages, usually under 200 pages for the most part. I like to read those really short condensed stories. I feel like 150 pages is usually like a good sweet spot of a really good short story, but I have a couple favorites that are in the 200 page range as well, so I wanted to just include everything under 300 pages, and I'm going to break it up into a couple different categories because I didn't want to do just thriller and just horror. I wanted to do a little bit more by like trope or vibe of the book because there's just a couple different categories that I noticed in my favorites. So we'll be going over these book recommendations in 4 different sections, including dark and disturbing horror, quiet horror, which is more like there's not a lot of action happening, but it just creates a really eerie sense of quiet horror throughout the story, survival, high stakes action thrillers where there is a lot at stake. It's really fast paced. And then the last category is just fun page turners. Some of these also have a psychological element to them. These are just more of like your really fun, fast paced thriller story where there's something going on, you don't know what it is, and you're trying to chase it to the end of the story. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump on into the book recommendations, starting with the dark and disturbing horror books. The first book I have in this category is a book I just recently read, and it comes in just a little bit over 100 pages, and that is Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by LaRocca. I actually read this entirely on ebook. I read this through the Kindle app, and I loved it so much that I ended up purchasing a physical copy just so I could read it again physically, maybe take some notes in here and be able to just have it on my shelves to reference because I just thought this one was so much fun. So remember, we're in the dark and disturbing category, so these books are not going to be for everyone. These are going to be for a very particular type of reader, and this book in particular is perhaps the most dark and disturbing book that I have ever read in my life. Even though it is super short, it manages to accomplish a lot of dark and disturbing things within just 100 pages. So this is a story that takes place in the year 2000, and it follows these 2 women who are chatting on the internet. So the entire story is told through instant messages and emails going between these 2 women. And the messages begin when one woman decides that she wants to sell an apple peeler online, which sounds really simple, but there's this whole complex reasoning behind why she's selling this apple peeler, and it's at a very large amount, like $1,000 or something that she's selling it for. And the other woman reaches out with an interest to purchase the apple peeler. So that's where their conversations begin. And from there, throughout the rest of the book, it just spirals into a very dark, disturbing, weird place. The story also begins with an author's note, which is not from your actual author, LaRocca, but from like the author of the story that you're reading, who is this person who's organizing these emails and instant messages. And the author's note comes with the context that one of these women has passed away. The ultimate demise is how they phrase it, and that there are certain things within the emails and instant messages that had to be extracted because of the ongoing court case investigating what happened between these 2 women. And so that also just adds a lot of tension right at the beginning of the story as you are kind of racing to the end to know what happened, what was the ultimate kind of conclusion between these 2 women's crazy conversations. I think the way this was written was just so clever. The format really pulls you in and makes you feel like you're spying on something that you shouldn't be, and you really can't look away from it. So that also gives you this weird, eerie sense of like, ooh, I shouldn't be reading these private messages between these 2 people, but you also like have to know what happens and where the relationship between these 2 women goes. Ultimately, it is a story a lot about just what can happen to humans who are really lonely and susceptible to manipulation. And it's really sad in that way, but it's also just really fun to read. Super dark, will definitely make you think, and may make you feel weird about certain foods after you read it, but it's a really good read it all in one sitting kind of horror story for those who are into the dark and disturbing. My next recommendation in this category is a dystopian story, and that is Tender is the Flesh. This is a story about what happens when in the future the government says that we can no longer eat animal meat because there has been this virus of some sort that has gone through and like poisoned all the animals, and it's not safe to eat animal meat anymore. And so humanity ends up turning to farming humans basically and becoming cannibals. And so there are these big factories, and you can even have like pet humans where they're processing human meat, and that is being distributed as a substitute to animal meat. I don't think I have to say how disturbing this book is. It is truly very difficult to read. It is not for the squeamish. And if you already feel kind of weird about meat or have anything in particular with meat, like maybe this one's not for you. But it is just so fascinating, and it really just makes you think about a lot of things. There's the surface level story of what's going on and what you're reading, but this is a book that you can really just analyze and dive into and think about the other story being told and what potentially could be hidden from the reader and what's really going on in this whole world. It is just wild. In this story, the main character you're following works at one of these factories where they process human meat, and then he ends up getting gifted a human to like farm and like keep as sort of a pet. The idea is that you have these humans and like leash them up, put them in a barn, raise them, and then eventually eat their meat basically. And so he is gifted a human. He already has conflicting notions about just the state of things, and that ends up being another catalyst into making him think more about what they're doing. Is it okay? Why are we doing this? How have we gotten to this place where we are eating other humans? And so it is really just interesting to follow that story really closely, but also just see the broader lens of what's going on. This is another book that I read like all in one day. I also did part of the audiobook, and I really enjoyed the audiobook as well. So definitely recommend this one. I think it's a really cool story, but it is definitely also pretty gross, and like I said, not for the squeamish. And the last book I have in this category is dark and disturbing in a more psychological way, and that is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Iain Reid. You may have also heard of this movie that came out on Netflix that was an adaptation of the book, and I liked both the book and the movie, but sort of for different reasons. I don't really think about them together in my mind. The movie honestly feels pretty different from the book, so if you've already seen the movie and you feel like you didn't love it and you don't know if you want to read the book, I might still suggest reading the book because they're pretty different, in my opinion at least. But this is a story about this couple who are in the car together, a man and a woman, and they are going on this road trip. He is taking his new girlfriend back home to meet his parents for the first time. And so a lot of the story takes place in the car on this journey to his parents' house, and is filled with a lot of just mundane conversations that they're having, getting to know one another, talking about their thoughts and philosophies and ideas and things going on in the culture of this world that they're in. And that's not going to be for everyone. It's definitely a slower story. You read a lot of it just wondering what's going to happen, when is something going to happen, what is this all leading to. I personally really love stories like that, especially when they're in a shorter form and you can read through them all in one day. I think those stories just keep me so hooked, of knowing that you feel this oncoming sense of dread and tension and like something's gonna happen, something's gonna be revealed, what's really going on here. This feels too weird but normal, and just like that uncanniness about the whole story. This book masters that feeling. So if that's the type of story you like, I would highly recommend this one. I also really like the atmosphere of this story, with just being in a really close encounter of the car. There are other settings that they end up taking place in as well, and there's a lot of snow. I just love a snowy atmosphere for a creepy read. It's like one of my favorite types of horror atmosphere, is when it is really snowy outside. I don't want to give too much away about this one because I feel like a lot of the fun is just wondering what is going to happen, and so I don't want to give away too many details, but just know this does a really nice job of building up that eerie, suspenseful feeling, has a really nice atmosphere to it. It will certainly make you think, and by the time you get to the end, you will be ready to get back to the beginning and read it all over again. I literally, the second I finished this book, started back at the beginning and started reading through the entire book again, because it is just that crazy of an ending that you have to go back and read the whole story with the new context that you have. Also, if you like adaptations, there's now a movie, so as soon as you finish the book, you can go check out the movie as well, which I also think is just really fun in its own kind of way. It's very artsy and just gives a different kind of spin to the story, I think. The next category of recommendations I have falls into the quiet horror category. So there's not as much going on in these stories. They're not quite as dark or quite as disturbing, but these are the types of books that really stay with me. And when I got to the end of them, I just couldn't stop thinking about them. I can't always remember the exact details of these books, but I always remember how they made me feel. So the first recommendation I have in this category is The Silence. This is a story about a catastrophic event, and the author actually completed it just a couple weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic really started to hit. And so the timing of that is just so eerie and wild to read. I read this book, I think last summer, like right when the beginning of quarantine was at its peak, and it was just insanely relatable and weird to read in this timing, but also just so thought-provoking and interesting. So in this story, you're following 5 people who are gathered together in a Manhattan apartment in the midst of a catastrophic event, and they don't really know what happened. Each of these characters are very interesting, and the dynamics between them are super interesting as well. One of the couples starts coming in on an airplane, and all the electricity kind of goes out on their plane, so they have like this crash landing, this huge kind of catastrophe before they get to the apartment. One of them can't stop talking about Einstein, and then there's just a mix of conversations going on between these people of really mundane things, but also kind of weird stuff, like talking about their favorite type of bourbon. And it's just a very weird little book. It's also Super Bowl Sunday, and so the game was supposed to be going on, but all the electricity is now cut out, and they have no connection to the outside world because their phones aren't working, and they're just stuck in this apartment together, not knowing what's going on, not knowing if the world's ending, and almost not even caring, just kind of carrying on being humans gathered together in this place. So it is super strange. It's very weird to read right now in our current climate. I'd actually really recommend reading it right now rather than kind of waiting. I feel like it's not one of those post-apocalyptic stories that it's too weird to read during this moment, but I feel like it's like just the right amount. I feel like it's a really good story to read for this time. And it also reminds me so much of another book I have in this category that I wasn't going to talk about until later because I was going in order of the amount of pages that it has in it, but I feel like I have to talk about these two back to back, and that is Leave the World Behind. This was a really popular book that came out last year that is about this family that goes on this remote vacation, and they're staying in this Airbnb, but then late in the night when they are getting ready to go to bed, they have a knock on the door, and it's this older black couple that shows up, and they're saying that it is their house that they're renting out to these people and asking if they can come in and stay because they typically stay at their other place in, I think, Manhattan somewhere in New York, but there has been a citywide blackout. They don't know why, and so they just came right here while everyone else was kind of panicking in the city. But there's no real way to confirm this because they're in a rural area. They now don't have electricity, phone service, television, and so they kind of just have to take these people that they've never met for their word, just kind of trust that they're the people who rented the Airbnb out to them, and then figure out this dynamic together as the world may or may not be going into absolute chaos outside. These two books are just so similar because they both have that aspect of the world right at the midst of catastrophe, like the bad thing has just happened and you don't know why it has happened, and instead of following the broader outside story of, oh my gosh, the world is ending, in both of these stories, they're a lot closer to how average humans handle these kind of situations, and they're very closed in. So in The Silence, you're focused just in that apartment with these 5 people, and in Leave the World Behind, you're just in this little like cabin with these 2 families. Now there's also a lot going on in this story about privilege and race, so it's a very deep, complex story to analyze, but both books are just so similar in the overall sense of eeriness that they provide, how they're both very like quiet horror books, and how you really can't stop thinking about them once you get to the end. The next book I have on this list is one of my favorites, and that is Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a story about a 12-year-old boy whose father has passed away, and now he is living with just his mother and his brother. One night he thinks he sees something. It's definitely not his mom, it's definitely definitely not his brother, but it looks a heck of a lot like his dad. So on a quest to figure out what is going on, if his dad has come back in some sort of spiritual form, this boy begins to map the interior of his house and really define every square inch of it. This is a very complex story that has a lot of different layers to it. You could read it as just a ghost story. You could read it with a more psychological kind of approach to it. You could read it more as a coming of age story. Overall, I think it's just a really beautiful, haunting horror novella. It's one of my favorites from Stephen Graham Jones. I always recommend this to people looking for a short horror book, and I think it's really good for a wide audience. It's also one that you can just read again and again because there are so many different layers to it and different ways to interpret it and different pieces that may resonate with you. I definitely flew through it the first time I read it because I was just loving it so much, but I definitely want to go back to that one again and again and just continue to pick up on new things in the story because I just think it's so great. And the last book that I have in this category is My Sister the Serial Killer. As the title suggests, this is a story about a woman who has a sister who is indeed a serial killer. And the main character you're following is a sister who always has to clean up the messes. The story begins when the main character's sister has now called her because she has killed her third boyfriend in a row, and she is calling her to come clean up the mess as she usually does. She knows that she should go to the police and that these things are not okay, but she also just loves her sister and wants to continue protecting her. But then her sister starts dating someone that she knows and works with and is secretly in love with, and she doesn't know if she can afford to wait around to watch him end up dead as well. So it's a story about sisterly love, what you'll do for your family, and what she's going to do when she's caught in this really tough situation stuck between her sister and this guy she really cares about as well. I really like the little blurb for this one as well. It says, My Sister the Serial Killer is a blackly comic novel about how blood is thicker and more difficult to get out of carpet than water. I feel like that is the perfect little funny description that just really captures the essence of this story. It's very fun and fast paced and it really makes you want to race to the end, but it's also just kind of quiet. Not a lot really happens in this story. It's more just about having to make this decision of what she's going to do, if she's going to continue protecting her sister or not. It's not the most crazy action-packed story, but it is definitely a super fun one. Now we can move on to the next category, which is all of my favorite short thriller and horror books that fall into the sort of survival category where someone is fighting for their lives in a bad situation. And the first one that I have on my list is one of my favorites of all time, The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This is a story about a family that goes out to this remote cabin in Canada for a little family vacation, and everything seems beautiful and relaxing and like it's going to be a great time until these strangers show up, forcing their way into the house, saying that if they don't let them into the house, then the world is going to end. And you don't know whether to believe these strangers or not, and what kind of situation they're really in. Is their life at risk due to these strangers, or is their life at risk due to the potential end of the world? This is a super tense story. One of the most tense books I've ever read. The stakes are so high. I felt so nervous for the characters the whole time I was reading this. It's a story of sacrifice and family and apocalypse, paranoia, and it truly just captures the feeling of terror. So if you like a home invasion story for all of the terrifying things that it can make you feel, highly recommend this one. It's one of my favorites of all time. Next up, another one of my favorites of all time, No Exit by Taylor Adams. I talk about this book all the time. I can't get enough of it. It's my favorite thriller probably ever, and it is just so fun. This is a book I read all in one day. It really captivated me and hooked me right from the start. It's got the snowy atmosphere, which I talked about being something that I really love, and the close quarters of being stuck and isolated with one or more people in a bad situation. So this story follows your main character who is on her way back home for a holiday break from college. She ends up getting stuck in a snowstorm and has to stop at a rest stop. And when she gets there, there's a couple other people who are also hanging out inside of this rest stop area that she knows she's going to be trapped with for the next however many hours until the snow clears up and it's safe to drive again. But the situation gets even worse when she goes outside and sees in one of the cars there is a child being kept in a cage, and she has to figure figure out if that's what she really saw, whose car that is and who is responsible for that, and if her life is in imminent danger. And it is so thrilling, so fun, so fast paced. I would love to see this as a movie. It very much has like action movie thriller vibes, so if that is your thing, I highly recommend this one as well. Like I said, it's one of my favorites of all time, so I recommend this to everyone. But if you particularly like survival stories, this would be the top one that I recommend. And then the last book that I have in this category is one that's not really one of my favorites, but I think a lot of people could enjoy it, and that is Devolution. I don't even know how to say this one, by Max Brooks. So this story is set up as a first-hand account of a Sasquatch massacre. I listened to this one on audio, and I would highly recommend that format as well if you're going to give this one a shot, because it has a really good audiobook and I feel like it really brings the story to life. So in this story, you're reading the journals of one of the residents of this little town that is like eco-friendly, environmentally friendly in the mountains. And so you're reading her journal entries from living in that town when things are normal to when things start to go bad and when a Sasquatch comes and starts murdering the residents. So if you're interested in Bigfoot stories, survival stories, interesting accounts where you're reading things through like journal entries, then I'd give this one a try. It wasn't my favorite thing because you kind of know what's going to happen if it's in the title that it's a Sasquatch massacre, so there's not a lot of mystery to the story, but it is kind of fun. There's also some science-y elements in there, so if you like science-y things, you might also like this. But in the end, it's definitely a survival story, so couldn't leave this one off the list. And then the last category that I have is just fun, page-turning thrillers or horror books that you can probably just read in a day because you're gonna have so much fun reading them. And in the nature of being fun and fast-paced, we're gonna be really fast-paced for this last section too, because I feel like I've been talking forever and I have a lot of books in this category. So the first one is The Grownup by Gillian Flynn. Yes, this is the same author as Gone Girl, and this is a 60-page novella that is a haunted house story. In this story, you're following a woman who is essentially a con artist who is out doing psychic medium tarot card work out on like a pier. She's kind of done that her whole life. She did it with her mom. She's used to lying to people. She ends up having a client who asks her to come out to her house because she thinks there's something going wrong with her son. And I don't even need to give much more away about it because it's only 60 pages. It's super fast, but there are plenty of plot twists packed into this really short story. It's got really great Gothic vibes. It's like a Victorian era house, super Gothic feeling, maybe ghosts, maybe some possession going on, maybe just a creepy kid going on. You don't really know. And I feel like it's one that you can kind of just read again and again because there's so many twists that by the time you finish it, after a couple months, you'll probably forget and be able to read it all over again. Next up is The Test by Sylvain Neuvel. This is a story about a person who is taking a British citizenship test. He's super nervous to be taking it. It's 25 questions, but after a couple questions, things start to take a weird turn. This is a super interesting story. It's also pretty twisty. It's also one you're probably gonna forget how everything plays out in a couple months because I don't even remember the full details of what ends up happening in this. I just remember it being a ton of fun, and it's definitely one that I would want to read again. Next up, another one from Stephen Graham Jones is Night of the Mannequins. This is a little slasher novella that is about this group of kids who play with this mannequin. They used to spend their summers playing with him just like kids do. They kind of neglected him for a couple years. They decide to pull him back out for a prank, and then the mannequin comes to life and he is on a revenge mission to get back at these kids for forgetting about them. Or is he? It's definitely a psychological story. It's tons of fun, super fast paced, and super exciting. The last 3 books I have are all a little longer, nearing 300 pages, but they're still really fast to read. The first one is The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. This is a story that is inspired by Jane Eyre. You're following this woman who is not always telling the truth. She's very unreliable, who comes to this rich neighborhood and is a dog walker. She is also stealing from like everyone in this neighborhood, and then she ends up meeting this guy Eddie who is very charming. He ends up getting a dog just so she'll walk it so they can have a relationship. They end up having a very quick relationship, but he has a missing / dead wife that she doesn't know the full story behind, and it seems like there's something else going on that may be putting her life in danger. Super fun. This is definitely one of those stories that is like rich people neighborhood drama, like Big Little Lies vibes. So if you like stories that are really like suburban rich people just dealing with their drama, then definitely check this one out. Next up is Layla by Colleen Hoover. This book is so hard to describe because you read the description and then you read the book and then you realize how hard it must have been to write that description to detail what goes on in this book. I'll just say this is about a couple named Leeds and Layla who meet at a wedding, fall in love super fast, have a really beautiful relationship together super fast. Something tragic happens to Layla. After that, she no longer seems like herself. She is really mentally down, and so to bring up her spirits, he decides to take her back to the venue where they first met at that wedding. It's like a bed and breakfast to have a romantic getaway, and then he ends up forming a relationship with someone else there that's kind of making him pulled between trying to recover this relationship with Layla, who has just not been in good spirits ever since her tragic incident, or potentially following something through with this new person. And this story is just so crazy, so wild. You will not be able to stop reading this. You're gonna be dying to know how it concludes. It is just the craziest thing Colleen Hoover has ever done, and I really hope she continues doing weird stuff like this, because this was really impressive and just a really fun book to read. If you've avoided it because you feel like you don't like Colleen Hoover's usual stuff of like just her contemporary romance, this is totally different. If you like weird thriller horror stuff, but like having Colleen Hoover's name on it has steered you away of it, don't let that steer you away. Give this book a shot, because I think you're really gonna enjoy it. And then the last book I have to recommend is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is such a beautiful Gothic story, as I'm sure you could tell by the title, but this is a story that follows a woman who gets a letter from her cousin. This is like set back in the 1950s. She gets a letter from her cousin who says that she believes her husband is poisoning her, and so she requests her cousin's presence. So she goes out to see what's going on, but then when she gets there, her cousin is saying nothing's really wrong, that she just had some illness and she was like hallucinating a little bit, but she is definitely ill and still recovering from that. She's just saying like, oh, I had a fever, sorry, I didn't mean to be so dramatic. But the cousin doesn't buy that, so she sticks around to see what the vibes are, just to catch the vibes of the place. And there may be something nefarious going on, and it gets really weird, but in the best way possible. So that is it for all of the recommendations I have for short thriller and horror books, all under 300 pages. Definitely let me know if any of these stood out to you, if you're going to be picking up any of these now, but also for sure let me know if there are any that I did not put on my list that are some of your favorite books that are super short and either thriller, horror, or just something weird going on, because those are my favorite types of books to read. I love being able to fly through short books, especially when they're weird and dark and creepy. It is just some of the best type of reading. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!